right? So, I think you guys are fantastic, and I'm very pleased to work in this industry. And look, it's not one of those careers that traditionally gets a whole lot of attention and love, right? Now, I'd like to change that. So before I dig into today's topic, what I'd like to do is show you my own personal hero and somebody I think that each of you in this room should probably know the story about. Now, does anyone recognize this gentleman? He's kind of unique in the world in being the only person in the history of the world to receive the highest military and civilian honors from both the Soviet Union and also from America. Right? And he did that because he did a little bit of user acceptance testing of a fairly important missile detection system that malfunctioned. And he's the guy who did not start World War III as a result. So software testing, software quality can be very, very important. Right? So again, thanks to all of you for all the fantastic work you do all day, every day. Hopefully, remember this story, tell your friends, hold your heads up high. Now, that was the Soviet era, the Cold War. Hopefully we're all a little bit further back from the brink today, but today's testing landscape is also quite a complex beast. We need to deal with the reality of today's world, which is good or bad, right? It is kind of like this in a personal context from about the age of 1, and also like this in a business context as well, right? So like it, love it, or whatever, right? This is the reality that we need to deal with now. And people talk to each other via these things. Businesses transact business services with their customers in the same sort of way. And I'm sure that every company here is either web first or mobile first, or certainly charging down that direction. COVID accelerated the process, but we were all heading in that path anyway. So here, this is what we have to deal with. Now, as that transformation has taken place, there's also been a number of industry trends that have also significantly transformed the landscape. In past times, we might have had a relatively small number of relatively stable, mature, large, dominant companies in a given industry, think banking or insurance or something like that. Now, there's been deregulation, there's been digitization, there's been a lot of new market entrants coming into these various fields, and so the competitive landscape today now looks a lot more crowded. And oftentimes, you've got these smaller, more agile, more dynamic, less bricks and mortar type organizations that can literally innovate and transform at a moment's notice, right? So competition is now much more intense, and software quality plays a big role in that. So if we look at how businesses are interacting with people, it's a little bit different to what it used to be. Back in the good old days, I'm old enough to remember those, right? I used to go down to the corner store or the supermarket and buy my groceries. Now, if I had a bad customer service experience at an organization, a shop like this, I might choose not to pay, might choose not to buy something that day, but then the next day, the next week, the next month, I kind of don't have that many choices. So I'll probably go back and continue spending my money with that business, right? Then as things, the internet came along and now we've got online commerce and so on, it's a little bit different. If I have a negative experience with eBay, right, I might choose to go to Amazon.com, right, or AliExpress or something like that. So one user having one negative experience can actually have a lifetime impact on that business's revenue from that one user. And now, with the social media era, right, it's even worse. Right? If I have a bad experience, just one person by myself, I can go on Reddit and Facebook and everywhere else and start whinging and moaning about it, and that can be amplified by the social media effect, and so one negative experience can have 100 times or 1,000 times, or even worse, impact on that business's bottom line. So that's the reality that we need to deal with today. Now, that brings us to software quality, because software quality is your first impression for the end user. It's how you deliver customer satisfaction. It also has a direct impact on feature velocity, which means competitive differentiation for the business. Right? You want to introduce a new product or service, it better work by the time you publish it, otherwise it'll go horribly wrong. And that relates to customer retention, all of which boils down into revenue. Right? So software quality is vital to the success of every business these days, and really the way that the end user perceives it is termed end user experience. And so that brings us to the question of, well, how do we test for that today? You know, what do we need to do? Is it just one simple thing? Unfortunately not, right? It is a bit of a complex beast. And I've kind of put together a couple of trifectas here, right? So I've tried to categorize and bucketize the things that we should be doing in order to give you a holistic view as to, you know, industry best practices that we see. So on the client side, missing a little graphic there. On the client side, we tend to see three things. To test the client device or the end user experience properly, you need to have a mixture of realistic or representative devices, and that's a whole slew of mobile phones. You have to have Windows and Mac, desktop browsers with Safari, Edge, Firefox, and Chrome. On the server side, there's a whole bunch of things you need to do. You need to have the right environment. You need to be able to put a realistic production level workload on that environment to simulate real world conditions. And you need to have the right kind of data in the right place. And that's a whole thing in itself. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Then for the data itself, again, there's a number of different aspects to data. Some companies in some industries, particularly the older ones that tend to have mainframe type platforms, they might have a need or a desire to use the real production data set in their development and testing environments. As we probably all remember from an incident about 2 years ago with one of our telcos here in Australia, that can be risky. So if you need to use production data, you better have a good solution for anonymization, masking, and compliance. Right? An alternative, and ideally much safer, way to do things would be to generate synthetic test data. Right? Now that's not easy to do, but if you can do it right, oh, it's much safer. much, much safer. And then, you know, during the course of the development, particularly developers, right, they might want to use production or synthetic test data, but as they're developing and like adding things to the platform, they often need different versions of the database, right? So you might, you know, develop a couple of new features during the course of a day or a week. You might need to have different versions of data that apply to each of those changes that you make. Right? Now, being able to produce and manage and perhaps version that data is also a really, really helpful thing. And then, look, I really kind of wanted to keep it to 3, but then I kind of thought, actually, given today where the industry's going right now, I should probably put something in about AI. Right? I didn't really want to, but then I looked at what we've already done in that space, and I thought, oh, yeah, I suppose, right? It's actually pretty reasonable now, so I'm sorry, I apologize. I wasn't sure what the word for a 4th trifecta thing was, right? So I stuck with the original trifecta title. But look, for AI, it is impacting, helpfully, in most cases, what we do, right? And we at Perf, you know, we've already done a bit of work with AI. There's still more to come. But things like creation of test data, right? That's a very hard thing to do, and AI can be very helpful. Right? And of course, the next key thing is for test case creation. Right? If you can do that with AI, that might resolve a lot of effort. And then finally, there's the analysis of the results, right? At the end of the day, all this effort that we put in creating tests, maintaining test scripts, running tests, and so on, it really is about getting the useful data out of the system so that you can do something meaningful with it. You know, find a bug, fix a performance issue, debug the user interface, etc. Right? So AI can be extremely helpful, particularly when you're running very high volumes of tests. Right? We have some customers who use our Perfecto lab to run hundreds of thousands of tests per month. We have some that run over 1 million. Right? So if you're running tests, whatever they are, at those sort of volumes, you better have a really great way, right, to figure out what the results mean. And again, AI can help offload the burden of that manual effort from you. Right? And just so that you have an idea of what I'm talking about, and that I'm talking about reasonable things here. Full disclosure, I work for one of the vendors. We're at a booth outside, and those are the products that we've implemented this stuff in within our platform. Okay. Now, looking at the client-side testing, these days nobody wants hardware. Nobody wants to have like 500 mobile devices in a cupboard somewhere, or spread around everyone's homes and desks, and having to shift it from A to B and so forth. Nobody wants hardware anymore. So what you kind of want to have is a cloud-based test farm kind of thing. Now, to do a representative job of a client-side testing, you've got to think, what are the clients using? And it's these kind of things, right? Real hardware mobile devices. You've got iOS, you've got Android, and you've got all the vendors. Right? Developers also like to use the virtual clients, simulators and emulators, because they can come in really handy when you just want to do an individual unit or a smoke test, something that doesn't require the camera and the GPS sensor and so on. Right? And you also need to really test things properly on things like your desktop clients and your web browsers. So even for those companies where 90% of what they do may be on the mobile platform, oftentimes, even say for mobile banking, for example, I can guarantee you there's one thing that I will never do on a mobile device, and that is add a new payee. Right? You want to have that big screen form factor, and you want to check very carefully, right, the account numbers and the names and so on. And doing that on a mobile device with your fingertip, probably not ideal. Right? So there's absolutely a need to have both the mobile as well as the desktop clients, ideally in an integrated fashion. Right? And this is what we have with our Perfecto platform. So the benefits of having something like this as opposed to a pile of in-house devices or similar, it's cloud, so it's zero maintenance. We've been setting this up and doing this for nearly 20 years now, so got pretty good relations with the manufacturers, and that gives us launch date access to the new devices, right? And pre-launch access to the new OS versions. And what that means is you can help get your testing done early before the end customers get the new phones, right? So it keeps your testing program ahead of the curve. Right? And like anything, no man is an island, to paraphrase John Donne. No computer system is an island these days. In order for this thing to be usable, it has to be integrated, automated, high performance, and easy to use. So Perfecto is in use by some very large companies worldwide and around here. Now, the thing that you need to do, and this is why mobile testing is actually really, really hard, right? And that is because the devices themselves have everything all in one place, right? If you think how many individual devices have actually been collapsed into this thing you hold in the palm of your hand, right? So testing for all of the different variables. What if you're doing a bank transfer and you're driving in a car and you go into a tunnel and the signal drops out just as you hit send, right? Or what about, you're trying to pay your mortgage off and your mother calls you halfway through that action, right? Where's the money going to go, right? And what about, the screens like this, it's different to like that, and then there's like 100 different things that you kind of need to test for if you want to do it properly. Now, what we often find is, our clients, or before we start helping them, they kind of have this situation represented by this cube graphic, and I like it because it's very helpful. What it shows is, most organizations who've built up like an in-house or an ad hoc kind of mobile testing practice, they're able to test some platforms for some test cases, but they have a lot of coverage gaps. And they're able to find and fix some of the bugs that they discover, but because of those gaps in coverage, there's going to be a lot of stuff that makes it out into production and impacts the end user experience. Right. So with Perfecto, we're able to help them bring their testing program to that level of scale and sophistication and maturity that they want. Right. So you've got an automated high-performance platform that gives you all the device footprint that you need. It gives you automation and control to be able to test for all the individual use cases, and you can smash through tens or hundreds of thousands of tests per month. And as an example of the kind of data that you want to get out of this, again, I can go at length about it, but in the interest of time, right? Here's one failed test, right? You can see the history as this test has been failing for the last 5 times it's been run. You can see things like the English language version of the individual test steps that were being conducted. You can see which test step was being executed when the failure occurred. You can see the individual line of code that was being executed when the failure happened. And you can see both video and still images of the screen to see exactly what the end user would see when the failure happened. Right? So it really is like having the device in your hand. And together with customers like National Australia Bank, who've been doing this for a good number of years now and solved most of the hard problems quite some time ago, right? We've done things like added in the device vitals, so CPU, memory, network, traffic, and so on, so that you can help troubleshoot those really difficult things, right? So like the application looks like it's working okay, and no failures are occurring, but the battery dies in half an hour while you're doing that, right? So these things are extremely complicated to troubleshoot, and having the device vitals gives you that visibility and control. And I did mention NAB. NAB has been using Perfecto, just so that you can understand I'm not lying to you here. Right? NAB has been using Perfecto for a good number of years now, nearly 10. And the key point I'd like to highlight is, no system is perfect. There's always ongoing development and additional features and functionality required. And we've done a lot of work with them. And their quote, "Perfecto is great, but they've listened to our needs, developed and delivered custom features for us, and provided great service for many years." Right? So this is the kind of relationship that we seek to deliver. Now, that was the client side. On the server side, we also need a fair amount of stuff, right? So you need the back-end system performance. You need a way to evaluate the performance of the back-end platform. So you need something to put load on it. You need something to develop and manage the environment to eliminate environmental constraints and delays from your testing program. You need to be able to test and integrate and centrally report on the end user experience metrics for your client-side devices. And ideally, to help with the troubleshooting, which is the whole point of the program, you need to be able to integrate your APM data as well. So as an example, if you put a workload of 50,000 virtual users on your major banking platform or your ticket sales system when Taylor Swift comes out again, right? Right, you see, okay, it's slowed down. Right, now, what was the impact on the end user? What did it look like on a web device? What did it look like on an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy platform? And if it went wrong, at what time was the performance impacted? And by uniting it with the APM data, you can do things like, okay, so I found a problem at 3 minutes and 10 seconds into this performance test run. Now, what was happening on the server side when I did that? And go down, like drill down into the individual processes running on the server, and you might see, okay, at that same time, this process spiked the CPU, right? So now you know exactly what you need to do to go and fix that problem, all from one test. It's pretty great. Now, looking at the environment, and Trong from Deloitte in the previous talk gave a lot of insights into things like virtual services and APIs and so on. And the virtual services and the test data in particular can be extremely helpful in enabling you to run your tests anytime you want without having to wait for in-house dependencies or third parties, right? And oftentimes, in an application test environment, you might have and need to test the front end and the back end, but that's not everything, right? There might be 20 or 30 other moving parts to a typical application that you don't own, and sometimes you don't control, and sometimes you can't physically test. You think you don't want to have to send a package shipping request to FedEx every time you run a test, or pay 50 cents to send an SMS times 10,000 when you want to run a test cycle, right? So being able to mock these things up with virtual services and being able to generate test data, realistic, useful test data, eliminates those environmental constraints. You only have to mock up your immediate neighbors, right? So you don't necessarily have to mock up 30 different platforms. It might be 2 or 3, right? And you do need to have good test data so that the virtual services can be programmed to receive and to respond accordingly during the course of your tests. Right? So the BlazeMeter platform can do all of that. Now, in a test environment, if you want to test end user experience, then you kind of need to have something that looks like this, right? So you need to be able to test for GUI browsers with something like a Selenium grid type function. That can be either done by a Selenium grid, BlazeMeter has those capabilities, and Trifecta also has the web browser simulation capabilities too. You need to be able to generate a realistic production level workload. Typically virtual users are what's used for that. It's cheap and it's much easier than doing that by hand with real clients. And then you need to have a representative application stack. Now you've got your mobile gateway, your web server, and then of course all the back-end infrastructure, all feeding data into the APM tools. Right? Now the good news is that any or all of these components can be virtualized and can be run as virtual services, right? So if, like most people, you don't have everything ready all the time, you're waiting for other teams to provide this infrastructure for you, or it's just too hard, you can take back ownership and control and just get your work done by yourself in your own time. And the kind of key metrics that we want to look for here, the KPIs that you want, things like user experience, page load times, and device vitals at the user side, and transaction response time, server-side vitals, and overall throughput on the server side. Okay. And here are some examples where you can see the unification of the performance and the functional testing all shown within the same user interface. Right? So, you can configure the test quickly and easily. You can record and run the test using things like the BlazeMeter Chrome Recorder, right? It's a plugin, you download it free of charge, put it on your Chrome web browser, and then just do a normal action, right? So you go to anz.com, right? Type in your username and password, log into your bank, check the balance, transfer money, whatever. All the time, the system is recording your actions. You can comment, parameterize, reorder, do things like that, and then at the end of the test, it will spit out a test script for you, either as a JMX or a Selenium file or both. Right? So again, it's very, very quick and easy test creation, and record once, run 10,000 times. And you can see the kind of performance test results that you get there. Again, sorry, the text is a little bit small here, but in a single pane of glass, you can configure it to display any and all of the gathered data in whatever format that you want. It's all shown in real time So you don't have to wait until the end of a soak test that runs 24 hours to see what happened, right? The data is updated in real time. And you can see things like, the current maximum virtual users, the throughput, the errors that you're seeing, the average and the 90th percentile response time, total bandwidth, all of these key metrics that you might want to display. In a similar fashion, you can get the end user experience from the GUI functional test also displayed in the same platform. And the key things are typically things like the waterfall diagram, where you can see how long it took for the individual elements on the page to be displayed, downloaded, activated, etc. And the really cool thing is, here at Perf, because we have both the client and the server-side testing tool, we've united them together. So you can actually get things like the test results from your iPhone 16 Pro Max shown on the same graph as your server-side load performance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, integrating the APM data into the performance test results enables you to quickly drill down and highlight exactly what's gone wrong and what you need to fix. So the next topic is really about the test data, right? And again, there's kind of three elements here. So in a typical testing environment, what you might want to do is you might want to have a simulated load of, or be able to simulate a realistic cross-section of your customer base. Right? And if you're doing a consumer-facing thing, you might want to have 10,000 realistic yet perfectly fake and safe user records for people living here in Melbourne. Right? You might want name, address, telephone number, postcodes, credit card numbers, and driver's license details, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Now you can either type that out from the white pages, right? Or ideally use a tool to help you generate that data. Right? Doing test data right is a complex thing. Having an automated tool that can do that for you is very helpful. Now, apart from the user records themselves, you're going to also need similar but probably different data that's going to be used inside your data store for the application backend as well. Right? So you need to have that same username and some other information that the system uses, like order numbers, parts, et cetera, bank balance, whatever you have in there. And then finally, we've also got things like authentication systems or external user directories where you might have roles and the AAA kind of stuff. So being able to do that, either using a real platform or perhaps more easily via a virtual service. Again, you need the right amount of the right type with the right fields of test data for that too. Right? So front end, back end, and virtual services all need good test data. And so the next thing is, when you're building your application, as you're doing things like, say, adding new features or functionality to the code, you think someone like, I don't know, KFC, they might start to sell, well, they sell chicken and burgers, and then next month their marketing team says, that's it, we're going to sell pizza, right? So you might look at the app developers, the testers, they might go, wow, we've got lots of data on people and chicken, right? We don't have no information at all about pizza. So the developers and testers are going to need to be able to, add information to that, and they're going to need to continue to manipulate this information that's probably based on the production data set and has most of it, if not all of it in there, maybe with anonymization and masking for safety, but be able to add in and perhaps generate new information for these new features, for these new products and services that the developers and the testers are developing and testing. Right? So the ability to be able to create different versions of your database and also pad it out with new synthetic test data that's created on demand, on the fly, can be extremely helpful. Another thing you can do, and sorry, the graphics, the colors don't always come out perfect here, but and again, because these presentations are all being shared, there's a lot of words on here that normally I wouldn't put. But if you focus on here, what we're showing here is, say this might be a typical workday in your process. Right? Now, first thing in the morning, as the team is getting started, what you might want to do is refresh your test data set. Right? So take a snapshot from the production database, perform your anonymization and your masking activities, and then have it prepared and ready for the team to use throughout the day. And then during the course of that workday, as perhaps you're running some automated regression testing cycles, you might bookmark the data at 10 a.m., you might make some changes, testing your new products, adding in some features and so on, run that for a couple of hours, and then after that process is finished, you might choose to wind it back. All right? If a test fails, if there's something you want to run again, you want to make an update, you can then go back and do everything from exactly the same state without having permanently broken anything. Right? And similarly, later in the day, just like you would branch your code, you might choose to take a virtual branch of your production database as well. Right? So there's a lot of sophisticated things that you can do that without a tool that's capable of helping you manage that would actually be very, very difficult. Right? And so the Perf Delphix tool does a great job there. And the kind of things you can do is it enables you to do things like destructive testing, alpha-beta experiments, parallel development, and share the data with different users. And so, versioning the database, eliminating independent data environments, and delivering data to unique personas in your organization are all benefits that you can gain. And what this means is, if you look at how test data is typically used and consumed in environments today, what you might have is a slow and expensive cost to stand up your individual development environments that honestly, most of the time are going to be idle. Right? So there's storage costs, there's cloud costs. These data sets themselves tend to be very large in size, terabytes, if not larger. And so, your ROI from your expenditure on this from the cloud, et cetera, can be very low. Right? So with a tool like this, such as Delphix, and together with the synthetic test data edition of BlazeMeter, it gives you the ability to do running your test, version controls, and bookmarking and tear things down so that you can run many more tests more frequently with fewer pain points and drive that utilization right up. Okay, so I'm on the kind of home stretch here, my fourth trifecta with AI now, right? And there's a couple of things. We've talked about synthetic test data and how complicated it can be to generate realistic yet safe production data. I don't know about you guys, my mother had to get a new passport, right? When Optus had their data breach incident, and she was not impressed, and I'm sure 10 million other Australian people felt pretty similar, right? So being able to generate realistic yet PII or GDPR safe test data, highly recommended, right? So if you want to do that, then there's certain things you need to be able to do. You want to be able to identify test data that you've probably already got on hand, and you might want to say, let's start with this as a base, and then let's build upon that existing seed list that we have, or use it as a template, and then generate 100 times more. Right? You might want to be able to have the system suggest user records for you, right? So things like, I want realistic, male names for people aged 20 to 30 living in the USA, right? So, with all the sophisticated data profiling and so on, there are some very sophisticated things that we can do there should you have a need to do that. It's nice to have that capability. You might want ladies' names over 65 or something like that, for example. Parameterization as well. So again, a lot of times you have test scripts that have data values hard-coded in them. It'd be nice to be able to use an AI tool to say, run through these 10,000 separate test cases that we all have lying around and say, can you please update all of these hard-coded values to, bracket username, bracket password, etc., so that you can parameterize and run those tests more effectively. And then finally, you want the platform to be able to create and run things using mock services and synthetic test data. And we've got various options here, built-in functions or seed lists, AI-driven test data generation, and then the final thing is natural language, right? So this is the direction that the technology is going, and fortunately, we've already put that out in the BlazeMeter platform today. The next thing, yeah, so exactly like I said. So if, for example, I wanted to type in, give me 10,000 user records for people living in Victoria, right? The system would be smart enough to understand that and generate that with credit card details, name, address, telephone number, postcodes, et cetera, and that would all be realistic and yet completely safe. You're welcome. Then the next thing is the test execution itself, and there's a couple of parts to it, funnily enough, 3 more. Right. So a lot of the heavy lifting would come in the creation of the tests themselves. And again, natural language inputs and things like recording and test plans. It'd be nice if you could just kind of feed it into the machine and be able to get something useful out of that. Right? So there's a lot of work that's ongoing in that area. There's also a fair amount that's going on in navigation within the test environment, particularly for things like visual context. And then, again, the proof of the pudding is in the test results and how easy it is, how meaningful the data is, and how quickly you can get something back out of the platform. Right? So a lot of the effort these days, now that we've got automation pretty well under control, a lot of the time and effort is spent in the results analysis. And so adding in AI capabilities there, adding in the AI capabilities there is going to be extremely helpful. Right? Now, the main change, and this is quite a big paradigm shift, is that when you have these kind of capabilities, then the scripting largely goes away. Right? Now, most companies, have been doing this for 10, 20 years. They've probably got 10, 20,000 test scripts, of which there's probably about 10, 20, sometimes 30% that just always fail, right? It's the maintenance of that large, long-tail backlog of, what can often be legacy test scripts and so on that nobody's maintained or the platform's not there anymore, right? That just cause noise in the system, right? And so now that we're shifting away from the traditional scripts, everyone knows how much effort is involved in script maintenance. That also largely disappears, right? So we're trying to make your lives easier here, not harder, right? And that really is the promise of the AI. And as an example of the validation here, this again comes back to things like the natural language capabilities. So doing things like pixel by pixel analysis of small screens to make sure that things are presenting what you want in the way that you want and are consistent from platform to platform, test to test, version to version, that's tricky and can be quite tedious. Right? So being able to ask the question and just have the system do that for you, that can be super helpful. Right? And because it's AI, there's actually some very sophisticated things that you can do. An example here, you've got the weather report on the screen there, and you've got temperature and humidity ratings and so on. And you can actually ask it questions like, is the humidity displayed in the chart decreasing between 6 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Right? When you think about it, that's actually a pretty sophisticated question to ask a test platform that ordinarily you wouldn't think the device or the platform would be able to handle something like that. So adding in those capabilities with what we call the AI-driven visual validation, right? That actually gives you a pass or fail in that regard. So that's a pretty big advancement. And so kind of coming to the end of my, my presentation here, before I dive into the conclusion, I'll just show one more thing. I showed you the NAB case study. This one is for the other major bank in Australia who's been using BlazeMeter for a good number of years. Everything I just described to you is what they're doing. All right? So apart from some of the AI stuff, right, I'm actually not making this up. And again, the final piece really in the puzzle is the virtual services. And as an example of a very large global organization who's actually done that already, right, and saved themselves millions and millions of dollars, or pounds in this case, in doing that, is British Telecom. Right, so there's a large multinational telco who's running web services, ISP, they've got IPTV services for the UEFA Cup, which has about 1 billion users watching worldwide. And of course, they have landline telecommunications and 5G. Right? So that's a pretty comprehensive test requirement they've got there. BT has 19,000 people using BlazeMeter. Right? And one of the key things that they had was the rollout of their new 5G network infrastructure. Right? So the thing is, they'd kind of made the strategic direction to go with Ericsson, and they were going to buy it and so on, but they didn't have any of the equipment. Right? And the testers are like, well, we kind of need to test everything and make sure that we think it's going to work, but we don't have any. Right? So they were able to use service virtualization and synthetic test data generation and load testing to do all of that. Right? So their 5G network rollout came in on time and on budget, which that's a pretty great result for something of that scale. All right? So in conclusion, you know, all the testing trifectas that we've shown you today, you know, we can help you with all of that, and it's a great thing to do. You get your end user experience on web and on mobile clients. You get everything at the server side tested, and sophisticated control of production and or synthetic test data. All right? And that's what you need to do things correctly these days. Thank you.
Hey, Charlie.